What are the 7 deadly sins when selling your home? In today's video, we're going to discuss 7 of the biggest mistakes you can make when you're selling your home. This is not one of those videos where I'm going to say the biggest mistake is not hiring an agent. These mistakes can be made even if you hire an agent. That's our topic for today's video, and we're going to get started right now. The first mistake is made after the home is under contract, and many sellers may have the best of intentions when they make this mistake. But understand, this is a big mistake. The first mistake we're going to talk about is going to be pre-occupancy. This mistake isn't a problem until it's a problem. Then it becomes a huge problem. What is pre-occupancy? Pre-occupancy is when you sell your home, and while the home is still under contract, it hasn't closed, you let the buyer move in before closing. Many sellers fall into this trap without knowing what happens if. What happens if the buyer's financing is not approved? So the buyers move in, then 2 days before closing, the buyer's financing is denied. If you don't think it can happen, it can. This happened to a seller in our market not too long ago. Now what happens? The buyer moved in. Now what? It depends on if there is a pre-occupancy agreement. A pre-occupancy agreement is not a sentence written into the blank space in the purchase agreement. It is something that should be an entire document spelling out exactly what happens if. And here's the deal. If a buyer's agent asks if they can do a pre-occupancy, the agent is obligated to ask. Now, as a seller, you have the option of saying yes or no. Most buyer agents know that when they ask, there's about a 97% chance it's going to be denied. There is no benefit to a seller for doing a pre-occupancy. What happens if the buyer moves in and then just changes their mind? That can happen. I've seen buyers change their mind 10 minutes before closing. A deal is not done until the deal is done. If you're a seller and the buyer asks for a pre-occupancy, I don't care if the house is completely vacant. Just do a Nancy Reagan and just say no. Sometimes a buyer will ask, can I move some of my belongings into the garage before closing? This sounds harmless. Why not? Nope. What happens if the property's damaged before closing? What happens if someone gets hurt moving in? What happens if the buyer moves their belongings into the garage, then decides to burn the boxes in the fireplace in the house, which they weren't supposed to do? They were just strictly told they can move their belongings into the garage. Then what happens in the course of burning those boxes in the fireplace? They proceed to catch the house on fire. Can that happen? Yes, it's happened in our market. Long story short, this can all be avoided by just saying no. Now, when I have sellers, I say to the sellers, hey, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to tell me, Dave, we wish we could, but unfortunately, we can't. Moral of the story, if you're a seller, then say no to pre-occupancy. The second mistake is disclosure. Disclose, disclose, disclose. Don't try to hide things on a disclosure from a buyer. You might be tempted to, but don't. Here's the brutal truth. I've had some sellers disclose some pretty ugly stuff on a seller disclosure statement. Fact is, almost everything nowadays is signed electronically, and the buyer doesn't even bother to read the disclosure. If a deal is going to go south, and if you're going to end up in a courtroom, more than likely it's going to be because of the seller property condition disclosure statement. If you're a seller, when you fill out that disclosure, fill it out honestly and completely. Again, chances are the buyer's not even going to be looking at it. I had a seller one time disclose that there was no water pressure to the upstairs bathroom. It was disclosed in writing on the seller disclosure, and the buyer did not do a home inspection. Now, at the final walkthrough, the buyer agent called and said, hey, there's no water pressure to the upstairs bathroom. And I said, yeah, we know. We disclosed it on the disclosure, and your client signed the disclosure. I'll see you at closing. If you buy a home and you opt out of doing a home inspection, then when you looked at the property, guess what? That was your inspection. Understand the significant amount of risk involved when you opt out of doing an inspection. If you're a buyer and if you get cold feet, the best way to bail on a deal is during the home inspection time period, because during that time, you can deem the property unacceptable for any reason and bail on the deal. Now, the next mistake involves inspections, and number 3 is going to be repairs from the home inspection. Now, this mistake is made when a seller inadvertently buys the house back. And here's what I mean. Let's say the buyer does a home inspection and asks for a reasonable repair. For example, in Nebraska, we have high levels of radon gas. If a buyer conducts a radon test, the buyer may ask the seller to install a radon mitigation system. Now, in today's world, that's going to run you around $1,500 to $2,000. About 15 years ago, I had a seller who said, you know what, we're not going to make that repair. And that would have set the seller back at the time around $800. So the deal fell apart and the home went back on the market. So the seller inadvertently bought the house back for $800. Well, 5 months later, the seller sold it for $8,000 less. The seller, guess what, had to install a radon mitigation system, and the next inspection called out the roof. So the seller had to install a new roof, which was about $7,000. Now, 5 months went by and the seller had 5 months of payments. The house was vacant and the seller had an additional 5 months of utility bills. Now, all total, the seller was out another $20,000 because they didn't want to make an $800 repair. Keep in mind, understand that after a seller is aware of a known defect, they have to disclose that defect to any future potential buyers. This seller was willing to buy the house back for $800. It cost him $20,000. And at the time, I advised him to just make the repair and move forward. It was their first offer during the first week, and they were confident that they would get more offers and it would have no problem selling. And this was right around the GFC. This leads to another deadly mistake, and that is sometimes your first offer is the best offer. This mistake is when a seller thinks it may be better to wait for a better offer. Now, this story goes back to a seller during the Great Financial Crisis who was selling a home in the Hanscom Park area. During the years of the GFC, it was not unusual for a home to take several months to sell. During that time, we had many listings expire. When I say expired, what that means is the home was listed for, let's say, 6 months, and then that contract period ran out, and then the seller would hire another agent. At the time, I was working expired listings. Now, this listing had expired 8 times. I was the 9th agent. Now, the home started out with the first agent at $225,000. Then over time, and over the next 8 agents, it was reduced in price. Now, when I interviewed for the job, the home expired for around $185,000. And I asked the seller, I said, hey, when you had it listed with those other agents, did you get any other offers? He said, yeah, I got an offer when it was listed at $225. We got an offer for $205, but I turned it down because I didn't want to give it away. Now, this was a 7-bedroom home. It had steam heat, and it was sandwiched between 2 homes that were converted into apartment buildings. And it was on a busy street. And this was all during the Great Financial Crisis. Now, I was the 9th agent, and I had the listing for a long time. The seller finally received an offer for $135,000 and took it. Had he taken the first offer, he would have put an additional $75,000 in his pocket. The home was vacant, and he was making 2 payments, and it took about 3.5 years for this home to sell. Now, long story short, sometimes your first offer is your best offer. The best time to receive the most amount of money is when the home is first listed on the market. The next mistake involves pricing. When you're pricing a home, it's best to price the home on an even break point, meaning do not price a home for $299,900. If the home is right around $300,000, price it right at $300,000. And here's why. When you price it on an even break point, you double your exposure. You pick up buyers who are searching from 250 to 300, and then you pick up buyers who are searching from 300 to 350. If you price it at $299.9, your home is invisible to all the buyers who are searching from 300 to 350. Number 6, compensation of buyer agents. Now understand, commissions are 100% negotiable. There's no such thing as a standard commission. When you're selling your home, your best friend is an agent with a buyer. When you hire an agent to sell your home, you want to encourage other agents to show your home. And you do this by offering compensation to a buyer's agent. If you choose not to offer buyer agent compensation, then your buyer who's interested in that home has to pay out of pocket for their agent. This might discourage a potential buyer from submitting an offer because they have to come up with more money out of pocket in order to purchase. Now, when you sell your home, you can hire an agent or you can do it yourself. I recently sold one of my rental properties in North Omaha. The property was listed on the MLS, and I was happy to compensate a buyer's agent. And why is that? Because I'm like any other seller. I want the most amount of money that the market will bear. And I'm going to do that by offering compensation to a buyer's agent. All right, number 7 is selling as is. Now, many sellers would prefer to sell as is. Now, understand that many buyers in today's market are FHA and VA buyers. This represents about 40% of the total market. When a buyer is buying a home and using FHA or VA financing, certain repairs may be required before closing. For example, something like peeling or chipped paint. Now, when you sell a property as is, you're inviting investor buyers. They're looking for a deal. When you sell to an FHA or a VA buyer, those buyers are owner-occupant buyers. An owner-occupant is going to be more willing to pay a little bit more because they're looking for a home versus looking for an investment. And they're going to be a little bit more emotionally invested in the property. Investors are looking for a deal, and they know that you can only sell it cash or conventional and that you've eliminated 40% of the market. What many sellers may not realize is that even conventional financing can require some repairs.